Hello there, Exalt Sutherland here, and welcome to my Leagues list for 3.26. Now, before you go into the description, open the list and close the video immediately. Allow me just 1 minute of your time to explain a few things. First and foremost, how does this list actually work? Like, there's obviously color coding here, and I know from the past when I've done these lists in the German community, there has always been issues with people reading this correctly and stuff getting misinterpreted, right? Then I want to address certain builds that might not be on this list, or why certain builds might not be on this list. And in the end, I want to go over my personal favorite starters for 3.26, just objectively speaking, not my personal and subjective list, but just objectively speaking. And then after that's done, there will be a segment about like 5 to 10 minutes where I talk about some different tips for league setters. These are just generalized tips for a league setter that you might not have thought about before. Just more obscure things, maybe even, that makes you reconsider potentially on what you're going to choose depending on your personal preferences, and not about like some YouTuber or guy like me telling you, hey, this is the probably mathematically like best build or something. Okay, so let's start with the list itself, right? As you can see, there's color coding here, obviously, from green over yellow and red, right? These three colors. And there's obviously some numbering going on here, but still I'm writing here, this is not a ranking. So first and foremost, what do the colors actually mean? There's a short description here, but that's not the entire truth. So for the colors, let me just start with yellow first. These are builds I generally would consider still very good, but they might be niche, they might be off meta, so it might be harder or easier to find affordable gear, but they might also have some weird interaction, or they require like a transfigure gem, which might not be too accessible early on, so it can be a bit clunky to start with. Or there are builds that require several buttons, or just weird mechanics, or need scaling, or they require, like, for example, cluster jewels, for example, the ambidexterity, right? The dual strike of ambidexterity, for example, this requires cluster jewels to a certain degree, and might not be as good as other melee options on the list. Doesn't mean that this is necessarily better than Shield Crush or worse than Lightning Conduit. It just means that this build, just objectively speaking, might need a tiny bit more investment to get the same amount of damage, clear, efficiency, whatever, compared to other builds that it can be compared to. Of course, a melee build cannot really be compared to a caster build in certain degrees, and even within melee builds, it might be different, right? So this is not necessarily a ranking, but more like a categorization of certain build archetypes, or just builds in this list, okay? So this also means that red builds aren't necessarily just terrible, bad, or unplayable. Of course, there might be entries here, which I'm still leaving in just for courtesy, honestly, to some degree, which, for example, Splitting Steel, it cannot return anymore. This build is practically dead for most people, but I'm pretty sure there are people out there, and we've checked this actually, who do not use return on this build for whatever reason, and they don't care about this, right? They still want to play this, and it still should be fine, or they think this is like a starter to go into other steel skills or whatever. Same for DD, right? DD technically is dead. It has been dead since like 3.25, but in 3.25 people still played it with Archmage or some other stuff. So I'm still leaving this here just in case there might be something going on here. But the category as a whole, for example, has stuff like Bone Shatter or like Blade for Blade Blast. Blade for Blade Blast, probably one of the strongest builds on very low budget, but is notorious annoyingly to play with like 2 buttons, or like matching cooldowns on Spellslinger versions or Arcanist Sprint stuff, or it's just for bossing and has terrible mapping capabilities. All these things considered make it kind of a risky pick, or it's like difficult to play for most people. The same goes for stuff like Bone Shatter. It's still good. Basically, this category is just screaming at you, if you know what you're doing, this is totally fine. You can play most of these things if you're aware how to play these, how to scale these, played in the past or whatever. If you're an experienced player, all of these should be fine, but they are niche picks and might be underperforming compared to others. In this case, for example, Bone Shatter probably underperforms compared to other strike skills like Lightning Strike, even though it's been nerfed, Molten Strike, even Frostblade, which technically hasn't been nerfed at all because only the projector part has been nerfed, which wasn't used in most builds. They haven't taken the return support gem, so it doesn't matter too much. But yeah, just comparatively to others, this just is losing out, right? And this is the whole theme here. Like, for example, stuff like Dominating Blow might be decently good and you think it's great, but comparatively to others like Absolution, it just loses across the board. Hence why it's on the bottom of like yellow tier, okay? So it's kind of a ranking, but it's not a ranking. Now, of course, I have to address the elephant in the room. On the top of this list, of course, there is Righteous Fire. This doesn't mean that Righteous Fire is the absolute best build. This isn't a list for like absolute professionals, speedrunners, racers, whatever. But this is a list for the people who actually want to look at stuff like this list, right? If you're experienced in the game, you already know what you're going to pick. You already have like 17 POBs ready with several different like ways to progress in case you're getting one item or the other. If you get lucky divines early on, or if you're playing SSF like me, for example, and you don't get certain uniques and you can't play a build even though it's good, right? But Righteous Fire is one of these builds who is absolutely reliable. It checks all the boxes for a league stat. That is great. It is very tanky, so you don't constantly die. You can progress easily. You don't have any special uniques, or the uniques you technically could take are usually cheap in trade, and you have massive amounts of support, wikis, guides out there on YouTube that can help you as a player play this build, right? Then there's stuff like that's objectively strong, like Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. I couldn't get by this list picking any other place than like the top 5 or something for this skill, because it's just really ridiculously strong, all things considered, right? And just stuff that's just like fast or like better than others. For example, we have Lightning Arrow here on 4th place, even though, technically speaking, stuff like Elementate of the Spectrum is just better. But as a starter build, and I consider a starter for everything that's just like day 1, maybe day 2, this is what the starter is about. It is supposed to get you to the end game. It's supposed to get you like 2 Void Stones. You want to start with this, go to T16 maps, and then be able to farm T16 maps. And Element of the Spectrum is possible, you can play this, but you need to get the gem in Merklab, or just buy it, which might not be too easy for most people, as this gem tends to cost between like 20 to even like 60 or 17 chaos day 1. Like, prices vary, of course, depending on the meta or the availability of gems, but just keep this in mind. For example, there's stuff like you have to consider in the upcoming league. There will be lots of people playing Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, which means that other red gems or other red transfigure gems might just be really cheap. For example, like Ground Slime of Earthshaking, I think it's called, should be reasonably cheap. Or any other Earthshader gem that is like Earthshader of Prominence, I think it's called, like One Spike, could also be relatively cheap. But the Snaking gem might be really expensive, maybe even a divine. We don't know this, but just keep these things in mind. That might change how good this is of a league stat, but keep in mind, this is like a ranking here for, not a ranking, but it is ranking gems based on their skill as well, like the objective, like power of the build. And this is honestly probably one of the most overpowered builds right now. It just gets so much damage for free. It is insane. Now, this is all there is to this. As you can see, there are several tabs here as well. There probably, when this video releases or shortly after, there will be a 4th tab here, which will cover mercenary gear as well. I'm gonna make like a list of every like single slot and good notable items on these, including rares and rare modifiers once we get our hands on these, which is probably just after league start. But most of the uniques should be covered there as well. And again, like if you see this video, as you can see, there is a version number here. You can, if you want to, there's no need for this, go to my Discord. I have several channels there that cover every single topic, from like builds, Atlas tree planning, just general discussion, memes, whatever, but also there's a channel with the changelog to this list. So if you see this number change, there probably has been something changed on this sheet, either by rearranging certain numbers here, like if I'm considering stuff like Elemental Hit of Spectrum, this being better than Meaty Slams, I might reorder this, and this will be a change in the changelog in Discord. So either you check the number here and just recheck this list over and over again, or you view the changelog in my Discord, whatever you feel free, or whatever you feel like doing, basically. Now, let's get to a different part of this video, which I teased before, stuff that I want you to keep in mind for choosing a build. So every league has a certain theme, a certain topic, right? And this time around, it is themed around mercenaries. Mercenary is our league mechanic. Just keep in mind that the Sigil of the Atlas technically isn't our league mechanic. That is something that is covered by the expansion. It's an Atlas expansion. It's still important, but just keep this in mind. So when I talk about league mechanics, I speak exclusively about mercenaries. Now, mercenaries are just little companions. Think of them like animate guardians, so you can give them items, for example, Perk Will's Toe, or other items which might or might not work well with your build. For example, if you have any source of dealing lucky damage already, then Perk Will's Toe probably isn't too good, and the build itself might not be as good as others in the upcoming league, because everybody else is going to play with Perk Will's Toe. So if you already invest decent amount of resources into lucky damage, then you are basically just the same as everybody else, but you've wasted so much resources on this. The same goes for stuff like, for example, Dionysus Prototype, right, which just lowers resistances to -200. That makes exposure and curses completely useless, and everything that's revolving around curses and exposure, like Elementalist or Occultist, for example, might not seem to deal very good if they're lightning based builds, of course, right? And stuff like this has to be considered. So keep in mind that whenever you're choosing a build, just double check with the, hopefully if this is available, with the mercenary sheet on my list here, that you're aware of what you're going into. Like if you're choosing lightning build, make sure that you maybe want to consider a mercenary with Dionysus Prototype, or if you have any lucky damage mechanic by, I think it's the yellow timeless tool. Sorry, it's been 11 months since the last leak, so I'm a bit slow just remembering stuff. But I think it's like one of the brutal restraint modifiers that allows you to have lucky damage if you don't wear a helmet or something, right? So if you do stuff like this, it might not be the most reasonable decision. Then, also considering this, just keep in mind what you actually want to do. Like, what is the goal of your farming, right? What type of content do you want to farm? And most importantly, what does the expansion or the league mechanic require you to farm? So in Secrets of the Atlas, we want to farm memory strands. So it's going to be just several different maps with potentially terrible layouts. So stuff like phasing would be great, right? Just phase through monsters to kill the boss quickly, to just progress through these strands more quickly. Or clear that isn't reliant on line of sight, that just auto targets or whatever. Because if you are going to go to a map that's like Celso, for example, right, you can't really clear this properly with a build that requires definite line of sight to a target, but rather just clears or AoE blast, for example, like Kinetic Blast or something. It can clear around corners or something like this, which might or might not be a good idea. So again, this is a point for snaking, which is why this is on the second point here on my list. Now, with that out of the way, you also have bossing that might be important. You have a boss race coming up for all the hardcore Sword of Self-Harm players, and just more bosses in general than you're probably used to, because we probably have to fight quite a decent amount of them. So a build that doesn't have any single target, again like Righteous Fire kind of, or other builds, might struggle a slight bit, right? And also, of course, like economy stuff and stuff like this, but this is more of a more specific type here. Now, my personal favorite for this league, and this is, I wouldn't say it's completely objective. It's obviously partly subjective, but of course, like I said before, snaking is, or the volcanic fissure of snaking is probably the best build right now. You can also play this as like a Slayer or something if you don't really like to play Berserker. It's possible, but Berserker is just way stronger for every slam skill, which is also why Bone Zone is so far down the list, and every like Berserker or speedy slam build is so far up in the list. Now, the other thing I would be interested about is Elementalist as either Golemancer or like Golemancer as Explosive Arrow Ballista, for example, which I'm pretty sure Patron is also reworking as we speak, or as I speak right now. But keep in mind that the Golemancer build, or like any Elementalist utilizing golems, might not be as good as you think it is, because those golems tend to die, so unless you can fix this, it might be a bit frustrating. However, it's probably the absolute strongest ascendancy in the entire game, period, without a doubt, at like level 38 or something. So whenever you do like your first lap, or level 32, 33, whatever you're doing this the first lap, right? It's without a doubt probably the strongest ascendancy with everything in the entire game at this point. Now, of course, stuff like attack builds might not get treated equally because you don't have any attack buffs up there, but anything spellcast related, dot related, whatever, is probably going to be very strong, especially stuff like the Stone Golem's buff to global defenses. Keep in mind, he still has the 105 life region level 20, which gets amplified by 300% to like 315, which is crazy. Now, all these things considered, I also predict that stuff like Slinger builds might be better. So this, again, Bladefall Blade Blast, which usually is being played as either Slinger or Arcanist Brand for triggering the Blade Forts, or stuff like just the, what is Corrupting Fever, right? Corrupting Fever, for example, was pretty dominant for mapping, at least in the past. So it might just be a very good starter, or just any like really clear focus build, depending on the content you want to do. And other than that, probably just anything like Champion or Saboteur maybe, because Champion has the like massive upgrade to just always have Fortify, no matter how much Fortify he can technically access, which means you can technically go to like 46 or like 45 Fortify. Maybe even 50 or above, but I'm not sure on that. I'm pretty sure like 46 or 45 was the maximum, but just keep this in mind that it might just be incredibly overpowered for defense to play Champion, or stuff like Saboteur with the Projectile Return, which might be interesting. I don't think it will be too great, because I personally kind of dislike Nimis sometimes, and it's just a 50% Nimis, so it might not be as good as people make it out to be. Now, there are some more changes, or not more changes, but more tips here, which might be interesting to you. This is something I sourced together with my community. I made a poll and I asked them on the stream as well, and try to figure out what are the like most important things for players usually on just on League Start, right? And the things we have here is, my first tip is something I try to take into account sometimes. I want to have a build that doesn't rely on suffixes, or at least has the option to have open suffixes, because I want to craft res during the acts on my gear. I just want to fix my resistance as soon as possible, potentially using hybrid stuff like fire and chaos res to also get my chaos res up, because this usually tends to hurt quite a lot once you enter maps, or like at least like yellow, or at least rare maps, the red maps, sorry. Something that is important. I think it should be paid at least some attention to. If your build requires you to have a lot of suffixes, it might get kind of hard to fix resistances. So keep this in mind. Then the second point on my list here, at least, is the endgame potential. Like, can you transform this build into something that is just greater, like a secondary build, or can it like scale indefinitely, for example, stuff like the Silent Righteous Fire, I'm pretty sure, that Captain Lance showcased. Stuff like this is also maybe important to you. Then there's the personal enjoyment part. For example, people I know like to have difficult crafting projects down the line. They just like to craft complex things. So maybe build that requires very specific items that have to be crafted in a very specific way that might not just be able to be purchased outright. So this could be just a thing for you, or just some obscure concept. For example, in the past, like I think it's like 4 years ago, right before there was a nerf to like Abyss Jewels and Golems and stuff, I played a Golemancer Elementalist with Abyss Jewels as the power save, I'm pretty sure, and they just nerfed all of this in the league after, but it was fun to play. It was a really interesting concept. Nobody else really played this back then, and it was really cool. So I also had to craft most of the game myself, and it was really fun, and can be fun for you as well. Not just playing the most efficient build in the game, which I also am a victim of, but this could be some fun project for you to do. Then people just tend to like certain archetypes. So it has to be like a mini build, or it has to be a bow build. So of course, I want to encourage you to think outside of the box, but if you're comfortable with a specific playstyle in a video game, just keep playing this. Try look for this. This has more than enough options here, and probably more to come in the future, but just try to look for different solutions maybe, and try to look out of your comfort zone. It might be beneficial. For example, me personally, I played minions earlier in my early days of PoE because it was just chill. I didn't have to do too much, and I really didn't like melee builds. And nowadays I'm just playing basically exclusively melee for some reason. I started bone zoning, which was fantastic. Thanks, Karn, by the way, for the great build, which got me into like a really heavy melee addiction for some reason. Every time I'm playing casters, is either cast on crit or some other cheese like self chill or whatever, and just trying to exploit everything not to play a self caster, which I fucking hate. So this might be something interesting to you. Now, there are also is a problem right now, which might be concerning to some or others. There's the validity of claims in terms of like cost, gearing, stats clear, etc. So there have been quite a few channels on YouTube. For example, the new like Uberdan channels, which are cruising through there. Basically, whenever you see a video and it starts with an AI voice, try to be perceptive of things that are getting said in this video. This doesn't, of course, is relative for everything, but those channels specifically, I think that like 4 channels right now, and they're just keep coming out of nowhere for some reason. There's like Uberdan channels just showcasing completely wrong and unrealistic builds and praising them as being like the best builds whatsoever, or like stuff like PoE builds. I'm pretty sure it's the channel's name, which is just an RMT site, which again is against TOS. So if you're RMTing, you're in jeopardy of like losing your account, and you're offending the terms of service. So your account can get taken from you or just getting banned. Something like this should be taken into consideration. Now, there's also, for people like me or others, there's the consideration that it should be SSF viable. For example, I do not like to play trades for a long time right now because I think it's just too easy. It's just too quick. This is, again, my personal opinion. It doesn't need to be shared by you, of course. But for me, I just finished the game in like 3 days, and then I'm just really bored when I'm playing trade because I have like 2, 3, 4, 5 mirrors, and I have everything in the game technically available. So it just gets boring. And SSF just is more of a fun grind. To build something from the ground up, you have to actually farm and engage with different kinds of contents. And I can't just choose the mathematical best build on day 1 and have to farm this for like 5 weeks straight. It just sounds kind of boring to me, at least, again. So it might be necessary for you to look for a build that is viable on SSF, that doesn't have any chase uniques, or that does have a specific chase uniques. The opposite can also be true, right? Stuff like this. Then, of course, it should be capable of doing 4 Voidstones. This is usually like a requirement for most starter builds. For some people, it might just be 2 Voidstones, but I personally think it should at least be able to kill all the bosses required to get 4 Voidstones. I think that's the bare minimum, because those bosses aren't too hard to kill nowadays, and every build should be able to, at least like any dot build that deals like 2 to 3 million should be able to, so any hit build that is like 5 to 6 million should also be realistically able to kill all the bosses and acquire 4 Voidstones. This isn't too hard to do nowadays, but if your build doesn't meet this quota, it might not be the best choice, honestly. Then again, like quick leveling and also being able to use your skill during the acts as well. So there is, for example, the explanation here, which I kind of skipped over, as to why certain builds aren't on the list, right? And of course, there are builds that you can build into later on the line, and builds you can play already in the beginning. For example, stuff like Smite. Let's take this as a perfect example. Smite isn't on the list because Smite can also just be used in any other build. Like, I can play Lightning Strike and just use a Val Smite gem in my setup and just use Val Smite every 12 or 14 seconds or whatever, and I'm pretty much good to go. There is no need for me to do anything else, right? Or I can just use a Val Lightning Strike with Rage support to just generate Rage. This also works, right? All these things considered, some builds are not here because they either are kind of obsolete or just something else is very similar to them, just already overshadows them, they're too expensive, or they're something you want to build into, which again, might or might not be the case. For example, if you start Smite, let's assume you're starting Smite, right? Which again, I wouldn't recommend. I would just pick something else, honestly, and just use Smite as a support. But you could start Smite and then build this into an armor stacker, which is definitely viable. And this might be something that's interesting to you or just not, right? So you have to keep this in mind as well. And also the just allows you to farm your favorite content as soon as possible. For example, if you're choosing something like Righteous Fire Chieftain, because you know this just levels really fast, but you actually want to boss, this might not be the best choice then. Of course, you can switch to a Juggernaut down the line, but it might just deter from your actual fun and enjoyment, so this might not be the best solution for you to pick. Then stuff like how much content can it cover? So can it actually do multiple content regions, like stuff like Expedition or stuff like Blight? Like, this is actually good at Blight. Does it have Explode? Does it have shields, slow, stuns, whatever? A good coverage. Something like this might be important. Then also, of course, the popularity. Is it in the meta? Is it not in the meta? Is it really off meta? This might or might not apply to you. Again, like, I'm just listing the things I know that people are kind of paying attention to. So some people really, I've had this in the past, they were asking me, hey, what's like the best league setter? And I list them like 5 different builds. And I'm like, yeah, but do you have like something more of meta? I list 5 more builds. And they're like, nah, I want to like again, go way further off meta, and I list 5 more very obscure builds, and like, nah, this is still way too meta. I want something very absolutely obscure that nobody's ever played ever before in their life, and this might also be something that's important to you, of course, and don't use this list, because this list usually covers something like in the meta. And again, it should be a thought at least, because stuff that's in the meta, and the more it is in the meta, the more expensive it usually becomes, but also there's more supply for just cheap gear as well. So this might or might not be a beneficial like point for you. Then there's also the map mod compatibility stuff, which is why so many people play Slayer, for example, because Slayer can basically play almost every map mod in the game. This also applies to other builds as well. I'm just picking Slayer as an example, but there might be a problem, for example, on Xerxes, if you're facing maps with like Elemental or Physical Reflect, which you just might not be able to do outright. There, of course, are ways around this. For example, the Elemental Mastery just allowing you to pick this to get 60% less damage taken, and then you just get any other 40% as well, and you should be good to go. Or like equip a Sybil Slayment as a ring. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called, like one of the sockets on the left or the right that's physical or elemental immunity, so you can also pick this as well. And stuff like this might be important to you if you want to just go into a map, alch it, and just go right at it and just completely obliterate, or if you want to actually use regex, take a look at the mods you have, maybe potentially reroll this, as it will also increase your mapping costs, of course. Then there's also the consideration of not being the necessity of respecking. So some people like to just do a small respec of like 5 to 8 points or something during the story, like around like Act 6 maybe, or Act 4. But some people don't like this. They really, really despise the thought of having to respec their characters. They just want to go one specific way, and this should also be something you should take a look at if you're looking at some POBs in this list, or like any build that you're looking at. You might want to reconsider this if you're really appalled to the concept of respecking something, or starting with something and then switching to something else, right? There's also like the concept of having a good base class. For example, I'm choosing a Berserker, which is base class of the Marauder is the base class of the Berserker, this way around. And I know that I can just switch to a Juggernaut in the endgame, just equip the new Amnesis Embrace, the new ring we will be getting for like absurd amounts of fire penetration, just equip Molten Strike of Zenith and just completely blast, right? This is fun to me and might be fun to someone else, but just keep in mind that you might want to change your base class. Then there's also the good MTX stuff here, like has the skill a good MTX? For example, people might like or dislike Celestia MTX. So it might just be an automatic S tier if you have a build that has Celestia MTX in this, and this might or might not be a good thing for you. Now, this is all I have here right now. I hope this might have helped you or might not have helped you. I can't help it any other way. I'm just blabbering about. Anyways, I hope this league list has been helpful to you. I'm sorry for my English, it might be kind of rudimentary. I'm still trying to get a bit more fluent in this, as you might have guessed, or as you might have known already. I've done content in German before, but as I recently switched out of the German community to do content in English, I'm not too familiar with English just yet, but I'm trying my best and it should be better in the future. I hope your league cycle is going fantastic in 3.26. Good luck, best of loot, and I hope you choose the perfect build for you. And if not, then we'll probably see each other soon, very, very soon again. And yeah, until next time, see ya. Bye-bye.